I'm indifferent.
I don't believe in God.
To the existence of
God is not judging them.
I don't have proof.
I don't know how to pray.
They're judging themselves.
Where is God in all of this? This is my home.
God exists.
What does it say about God that he created the orgasm?
I don't pledge allegiance to anything.
I don't pray.
Only to God.
If there was a God.
And I thought,
I just have this understanding that life is hard.
He could never love me after this.
God is still good.
Hey, Maybe God family. I'm so glad that you're a part of our YouTube family today. We're recording a video interview in our beautiful new studio as we get ready to launch a new season of the Maybe God podcast. Today's interview is going to be a part of a larger episode on addiction in America, featuring a former Major League Baseball player named Russell Dixon. And also our expert for this episode is one of the world's leading experts on neuroscience, especially the neuroscience of addiction and recovery. You might recognize her from the Netflix documentary where I saw her for the first time, The Social Dilemma. And she's also a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine, the chief of the Stanford Addiction Clinic, and she's the author of the great book, the New York Times bestseller, Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. So, welcome, Dr. Anna Lembke.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for making the time. It really means a lot to us. You have really blazed a trail here in the field of neuroscience when it comes to addiction and the ongoing conversations we're having about addiction in this context today. And it's interesting to me that wasn't what you set out to do. You started your career going a whole different direction. Actually, even you've said avoiding patients with drug and alcohol addictions. Tell us why that was and how this came about.
Yeah, so it was mainly because I had learned very little in medical school about how to screen or intervene for substance use disorders. I didn't really learn very much in my psychiatry residency either, which is the kind of apprenticeship specialty training period after medical school. So that when I started in clinical practice in the early 2000s, my own clinical practice where I was finally in charge of the work that I was doing, I said to the intake coordinators here at Stanford, I said, well, I'll see any kind of patient, just not patients with drug and alcohol problems. And that was not, I'm embarrassed to admit that now, but that was not atypical even for psychiatrists. Even now, it's not that atypical for psychiatrists, because we really did have this notion that addiction was not a disease, that it was not a medical problem, that it was some kind of social problem, and that patients had to go, to Betty Ford Clinic and get it taken care of, and then come back and see us about their anxiety, depression, etc. Which, looking back, is completely absurd. It would be like, sending a manic bipolar patient away to deal with their mania before coming back to get treatment for their bipolar disorder. But that was literally, how we were trained, and it's better now. We've come a long way, but I can tell you we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. Why do you think that was? Why were we ever treating addiction like a social problem or a character flaw rather than a disease?
There's a long history to that. So for most of the last 2,000 years, the problem of addiction, which has always existed in the human population in some form or another, albeit to a much lesser degree than now, the problem of addiction came under the purview of religious organizations. So, churches, mosques, temples. These were the organizations that essentially helped that particular vulnerable population. And I would say vulnerable populations in general. And then in the early 1900s, with the increasing secularization of our society and also the increasing medicalization of social problems, including problems of addiction, it came more under the purview of the House of Medicine. But even then, it was marginalized, despite the efforts of physicians, beginning with Benjamin Rush in the 1800s, arguing for addiction to be categorized as a medical disease, a brain disease, and to be treated as such. But it's really taken, about 200 years for the medical community to finally embrace this idea And the tipping point was the opioid epidemic. With the opioid epidemic, in which doctors were complicit, because the opioid epidemic started with the increased prescribing of opioids for minor and chronic pain conditions, and led to, then the transition now to include also heroin and illicit fentanyl. The medical community had to own their part and their responsibility in that problem, and at the same time, then also try to be part of the solution. So the silver lining of the tragedy of the opioid crisis is that over the past 20 years, I've seen a huge improvement in the education of physicians and other healthcare providers around the problem of addiction, as well as the beginning of an infrastructure inside the House of Medicine to treat addiction. So, we have an amazing infrastructure to treat diabetes. We have an amazing infrastructure to treat heart disease. We have almost no infrastructure in the House of Medicine to treat addiction, which is why, residential treatment facilities, for-profit and nonprofit, have risen up outside of mainstream medicine. But what we need to move toward is to integrate mental health treatment, addiction treatment inside mainstream medicine so that a person can walk into the emergency room and say, I'm in withdrawal, I need help for my addiction. And everybody there knows what to do.
Yeah.
That you have a protocol and also that insurance pays for it.
Yeah. It really is interesting. And I hadn't thought about this before we started talking, but it is interesting how differently we still continue to think of treatment for this disease, as opposed to how we think of treatment for diabetes or any other medical condition. Like, is there any other medical condition that is primarily treated outside of the medical community, strictly the medical community? Like we have these, as you said, for-profit treatment centers and recovery centers. We don't do that with any other disease, do we?
Not that I can think of. Of course, what qualifies as a disease changes over time, right?
Yes.
I mean, chronic pain didn't used to be a disease. People thought of pain as something distal or resulting from acute injury. But then there was the growing awareness that some people, even in the absence of a physical injury, have chronic pain. Mental health disorders of all sorts are really, visible disorders that have been conceptualized as, not just moral and spiritual problems, but also like, problems requiring like an exorcist or something, right?
Yes.
This idea that people are possessed, a religious frame. So we've really changed our conceptualization. One of the things that often is talked about vis-a-vis, the absence of care for people with addiction is stigma. This idea that people with addiction are treated as if they're bad humans rather than treated as if they're sick humans. So that's part of the problem. But I would say an even bigger part of the problem is frankly just the funds flow, the way in which it's very difficult and continues to be difficult to get reimbursed for treating addiction, which is guaranteed to not incentivize healthcare providers to go into that field. But things have gotten better with the 2008 Mental Health Equity and Addictions Parity Act, requiring insurance companies to reimburse addictive treatment or treatment for addiction on par with treatment for other medical and mental health disorders. That was a huge change within my career in terms of people being able to get insurance companies to pay for that treatment. But an ongoing huge problem is our workforce problem. We still don't have enough healthcare providers who are trained and educated and incentivized to treat addiction. It's getting better. We've created addiction medicine fellowships, addiction psychiatry fellowships. There's a lot more interest than there used to be, but we have a long way to go when you look at the number of healthcare providers who have these skills and the prevalence of this problem, on a national scale. Yeah.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the incentivizing of treatment. And I guess that's on the back end of the problem, but on the front end of the problem, where the problem has been created in a way, in part by the medical community, were there and are there still incentives to prescribe these drugs or overprescribe these drugs that lead to the addiction problem we're talking about? Are doctors incentivized in that way, maybe more so than they would be to treat addiction?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. So our healthcare system highly incentivizes and rewards prescribing pills and performing procedures. We are a healthcare system that primarily pays doctors for encounters, not for necessarily getting patients well. There are efforts to reform that, but that's fundamentally, capitalism and medicine are merged, and doctors are paid on a kind of piecemeal assembly line basis for providing pills and performing procedures.
Right.
The kind of slow medicine that takes time, that requires educating our patients, that involves non-pharmacologic interventions that must be repeated as behaviors over many months to years. Number one, it's hard to get patients to do those things because they're very effortful. And number two, we don't pay healthcare providers for those types of things, whether it's psychotherapy, physical therapy, mind-body work, you name it, all the types of sort of slow medicine that ultimately we know works best for chronic mental health disorders.
Sure. And, most of us are chasing our incentives. That's what we're wired to do, including physicians. And, that's a shame that incentive structures aren't incentivizing patient healing or recovery. It's more about creating more of a problem to be treated. And I know I believe you were on the forefront of that movement to call out members of the medical community who were contributing to the problem by overprescribing opioids and other, let's call them gateway drugs, I guess, for lack of a better term. Did you pay a price for that professionally?
Yes, I did. So in 2016, I published a book called Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. And, reading it now, it seems as if it's all sort of self-evident, but at the time that it came out, it was a pretty contrarian message. And I got a lot of pushback from the pain patient community, pushback from some colleagues, individuals who either didn't agree with my message or didn't agree with the way that I was communicating that message. So that's been difficult, but I guess, I've been able to endure it just because I'm so deeply convinced that the way that we are prescribing psychotropics and opioids has been largely harmful to patients, and that we really need to take a hard look at it. That's not to say that opioids and psychotropics have no utility. That's not my message at all, and never has been.
Sure.
I'm very grateful for all of those tools.
Yeah.
But we have certainly engaged in overprescribing to the detriment, not just of patients, but also any teenager who has access to, a medicine cabinet.
Yes, I'm sure that's a huge part of the problem. And when you talk about these drugs being prescribed, what are the most common drugs? Like, what are the names that we would that our listeners would recognize?
Well, so opioids includes things like oxycodone, OxyContin, Percocet, Vicodin, prescription fentanyl. A lot of people may not realize that there's an illicit form of fentanyl, and then there's prescription forms of fentanyl. So those are some of the common opioids. Morphine. In terms of psychotropics, 1 in 4 American adults takes a psychiatric medication, either an antidepressant, anxiolytic. Some of the most common classes of medications prescribed are the benzodiazepines, things like Xanax, Valium, Ativan. These are highly addictive medications that work short-term but have no evidence to support long-term use. Or no reliable evidence to support long-term use.
Yeah.
So those are the types of medications.
Sure.
Stimulants also, Adderall, methylphenidate.
Yeah, that is in the same category as, are those the psychotropics?
Yeah, so those are psychotropics, but they're in the stimulant category rather than in the anxiolytic category.
But again, you'd agree that those are also being over prescribed and overused.
Oh, without a doubt.
And so it's hard to argue with the logic behind the reasoning for prescribing these drugs. I mean, people are hurting. Like, how do you argue against putting someone, out of their pain, out of their misery with just taking a pill a day or something? Like, how do you push back against that and show actually that the net result of this is negative, both for the society and for that individual whose pain you're taking away? That's a hard argument to make.
It is a hard argument, but I think that the very first place to start is with the evidence. And there's no reliable evidence that opioids work for pain when taken daily for more than 3 months.
Really?
Opioids are effective treatment taken short term for pain for many people. But when taken daily over long periods of time, the brain adapts. That individual needs more and more to get the same effect. And the opioid can actually turn on them and make pain worse through a process called opioid-induced hyperalgesia. The same thing is true with benzodiazepines. No reliable evidence that they work long-term. They're good short-term to help with sleep and anxiety, but when taken daily for long periods of time, they essentially stop working, and then the individual is just medicating withdrawal from the last dose. Stimulants, same thing. When you compare children with attention deficit disorder who receive stimulants versus or with those who don't, what you find is that if you follow them prospectively and assess their school function, that there's no difference in elementary, junior high, and high school levels in those two groups. So stimulants are not improving school performance long term. In the short term, they, teachers and parents and children themselves will often endorse that they feel better.
Sure.
But the key here is, are you feeling and functioning better short term and long term, or is this really just a short term solution that leads to more problems long term? Yeah. And the evidence would suggest, as does my clinical experience, that most of these addictive, psychotropic, and analgesic medications contribute to more problems in the long term in a dose-dependent fashion. So, for example, there is reliable evidence that if you take an opioid, the longer you take it and the higher the dose, the more likely you are to get addicted to that opioid, even if prescribed by a doctor for a pain condition, and the more likely you are to accidentally overdose. And so those are really important data points.
I would say so. Very important, and I'm sad to say, unknown by the general population. I think
right.
That this data, I think, is hard to come by in the general narrative happening in the culture. But when we talk about addiction in America right now, I've heard you say that the addiction problem in America is growing. Numbers of people who are addicted is growing. And yet we're talking about more than just opioids, right? We're talking about more than just even, when I was growing up, it was like crack or cocaine and weed and alcohol. We talked about addiction. We're talking about a wider reaching problem that you're seeing relative to, I guess, an internal, the dopamine problem, right? Like that all of these different stimuli feed. Is that accurate? What are we seeing out there in terms of addictions?
Yeah, I think that is accurate. That's the underlying premise of my book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. The idea being that almost every human endeavor has now become drugified, meaning that it's made more accessible, more potent, has more variety, and is more abundant than ever before in the history of human civilization, such that all kinds of behaviors that were previously considered healthy and adaptive, like making human connections, has now become drugified through digital drugs like social media, such that not only are we seeing higher rates of addiction among the population that was previously vulnerable to this problem, but we're now seeing addiction in populations that we had long thought were immune to or protected from the problem of addiction. So, for example, women Historically, rates of alcohol addiction, men to women, for hundreds of years has been about 5 to 1. In the last 30 years, we've seen a massive telescoping of addiction rates in women, such that addiction to alcohol has increased 80% in women in the past 30 years. And now millennial women have rates of alcohol addiction equal to millennial men.
Wow.
Also among the elderly, a subgroup that we've typically thought of as immune to the problem of addiction, alcohol addiction has increased 50% in those subgroups. And we're seeing many, many people who are essentially, telling me that they don't really and have never had a problem with addiction to traditional drugs like nicotine, cannabis, alcohol, opioids, who are now getting addicted to all kinds of digital drugs, video games, online pornography, social media, online gambling, online reading, show watching, you name it. These drugs are sort of, taking over our lives.
Yeah. But I hear you say these things that make that list of different addictive online substances or digital substances, and some of them seem more nefarious than others. Like, how do you define an addiction? Because, how do you know if you're a video game addict or you just really like to play video games?
Quantity and frequency really matter. So if you're a daily user of any particular drug or behavior, and I use the term drug very broadly to include behaviors, but I always like to qualify that. If you're a daily user and you're using increasing amounts over time, requiring increasing potency over time, and finding that your use is interfering with your goals, dreams, relationships, work, values, then you need to consider the possibility that you're tipping over into the realm of addiction. Addiction is defined broadly as the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. Addiction is an interesting disease because its intersection with culture and society and normative behaviors is very strong. So, for example, in our culture, we value workaholism, and we don't really identify that as an addiction.
Yeah.
We've got legal drugs like nicotine and alcohol. We've got illegal drugs, which are in fact no more harmful necessarily to a given individual than nicotine and alcohol, and yet they're not legal, they're illegal. So we've got all these kinds of conundrums and hypocrisies and these changes through time. But I think the key message here is that we have more access to traditional drugs and new drugs that never existed before in an unprecedented way in human history, such that we're all become more vulnerable to this problem of compulsive overconsumption.
That's a really interesting definition. And I know that's the standard definition. You're not breaking new ground with that. But I think to sit and think about that would have me come to the conclusion that I can have a habit that's not an addiction if it doesn't harm or impede my goals, my relationships, all the things you listed. Like my coffee habit, almost said addiction. My coffee habit doesn't seem to impede or get in the way of my goals or health or whatever. Although I guess I should keep an eye on that. Isn't that kind of famous last words for someone who's probably an addict? I'm not an addict. But then you have something that seems like not, like we know caffeine is an addictive drug, but something that's not listed on the list of addictive drugs, whether it's, shopping or, can parenting be an addiction? Because it seems like your definition of an addiction would fit into what I see a lot of super parents doing. Or, just messing around on the internet, wasting time. That could actually be more of an addiction by definition than my coffee habit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're raising a lot of very important and interesting questions that touch on the neuroscience and sociology and philosophy. And I mean, this is what makes this area so interesting to think about and to talk about. When we think about habits are sort of ingrained or automatic behaviors. And the automaticity can be very advantageous because we don't have to make a decision to do something. It's already a habit. And in being a habit, we could be in sort of our sort of default mental resting state. We don't require a lot of energy to initiate the activity, maintain the activity. So habits in and of themselves, when I use that word habit, I'm already presupposing that we're talking about a level of automaticity, and we're talking about something that's either neutral in terms of its effect on us or potentially even positive, right?
Yeah.
But when we talk about addiction, what we talk about is really maladaptive habits or maladaptive ways of spending our time and engaging in behaviors such that it does interfere, with our, our goals and values, our health, in a way, importantly, that we may not necessarily appreciate. And so that's another interesting aspect of the neuroscience, that our reward circuit, which has been conserved across species and over millions of years of evolution, involves both the lizard brain, which are these deep, midbrain structures like the nucleus accumbens, but also the prefrontal cortex, which is our gray matter area right behind our foreheads. And it's really, the prefrontal cortex and the lizard brain talking to each other that allows us to respond to promises and perils in our environment, in an immediate way that can be very advantageous. But it's also true that what happens with addiction is that whole system essentially gets hijacked by this reinforcing drug, such that we begin to confuse basic survival instincts with our desire for that drug.
Wow.
So that our focus narrows, and that's all we're paying attention to, and we equate getting and using that drug with basic survival. So when that confusion enters, that's when, we're in trouble.
Wow. Now that is super interesting to me, because one of my questions has been like, why is it that the more comfortable we get as a society, the more addicted we become, at large, generally speaking? And why? Because we're not having to fight to survive anything anymore, really, most of us. We're not having to kill for our food or, run for our lives, usually on a daily basis. And yet we're still sort of falling prey to these other predators, these addictions that we succumb to. What is the connection between comfort and modern life and this addiction problem?
So our reward circuitry was evolved for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. And essentially, it was evolved for having to pay for our dopamine upfront, which is another way of saying working for our dopamine, walking tens of kilometers to find food, clothing, shelter, a mate. And it's beautifully engineered for that kind of thing. And it's also what's made us strivers, right? We're never satisfied with what we have. As soon as we get it, we feel the come down and we want more. So, in that kind of environment, an environment of scarcity, people with the addiction gene would be some of the most adaptive, successful, valuable people in a tribe, because they're the ones who won't give up, right? Everybody else is sort of like, I've had it, that's enough. And they're like, no, let's keep going.
Man.
Just a little bit further. It's right around the next corner. But, in this world where we have all of our survival needs met and way above and beyond, where at the touch of a fingertip, without any work at all, we don't even have to get up off the couch and our reward comes to us. By the way, very interesting, dopamine is our neurotransmitter that's not just fundamental to the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation, but also important for movement. So even the most primitive nematode or worm will release dopamine in response to food in its environment. People with Parkinson's disease have a depletion of dopamine in the substantia nigra. So dopamine is important for movement and reward, pleasure, motivation. And that's not a coincidence. Why? Because for most of human existence, we have to move to get our reward.
Sure.
We don't have to do that anymore. We're now surrounded by comfort. We're insulated from pain. And the result is that this fire hose of dopamine, one of the driving biological imperatives in nature and in our brains is this drive toward homeostasis, or to restore baseline equilibrium. And we all have a tonic baseline level of dopamine firing. And when we do something that's rewarding, it goes up, right? And when after that reward, it goes a little bit down if it's an intoxicant. So with this fire hose of dopamine that we're exposed to now, the only way that our brains can compensate is by downregulating our own production of dopamine and our own dopamine receptors, trying to, go into this dopamine deficit state as a way to compensate for too much dopamine. And the result is that we're more miserable than ever.
Yeah.
This, hedonism or this relentless pursuit of pleasure ultimately leads to what we call anhedonia, which is the inability to experience pleasure in anything that we do.
So the reason to start what becomes an addiction is because it feels good. And ironically enough, what initially felt good or like relief or numbness or whatever, a relief from pain, maybe, or some elation or high, eventually by the time it becomes a problem, isn't feeling good anymore. Like it doesn't make you feel the same way anymore. How do you explain that neurologically?
So all intoxicants mimic a chemical that we already make. And we make that chemical in our brains, whether it's our endogenous opioids or endogenous cannabinoids, all of which work on dopamine as the final common pathway. We make those chemicals as a healing mechanism in response to a painful injury, and also as a signal for approach or avoid. But what happens is that these same chemicals that our bodies naturally make as signals to us to compel our behavior, either to approach or avoid, they're also made in nature. For example, opioids are made in the poppy plant.
Yeah.
Cannabis is made in the cannabis plant. And we now have been able to engineer these exogenous or external mimics into these highly potent forms such that when we ingest them, we get this explosion of dopamine far exceeding what our brains have evolved to tolerate. And the result is this incredible come down where we go sudden increase in dopamine followed by dopamine free fall, not just to baseline firing levels, but actually below baseline levels, this dopamine deficit state before going back to baseline. So the key here is, in the book, I use an analogy of the gremlins and a teeter-totter. But the bottom line is that for every intoxicant that we ingest, and I include here TikTok, Netflix shows, YouTube, you name it, League of Legends, for every intoxicant that we ingest, we will have to pay a price, right? It's the equalizing force of the universe. And that price is a come down. And we may not consciously be aware of it, but it is there. If we wait long enough between ingesting intoxicants, our body recovers and, we go back to baseline. But if we don't wait, and we don't have to wait now because TikTok is infinite, then what happens is over time, we eventually end up in this chronic dopamine deficit state, which is the addicted brain. And once we get there, we need to use not to feel good or feel high, but just to feel normal, just to, barely bring ourselves back up to baseline. And when we're not using, we're in this subthreshold state of withdrawal.
Goodness gracious. That is, I've experienced that myself, and I think I've seen others experiencing it too, where, you're not using to get high. You're just using to survive or get back to your old self, your normal.
That's right.
And that's a really sad place to be.
It is. And it happens insidiously, and it happens without our really even realizing it's happened. Our brains are such powerful storytelling machines that we will look around us and find a million reasons why we feel crappy that's not related to our drug. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Because we don't want to give that up.
That's right. Yeah, from the people around us, they're the reason we feel crappy, or my job or whatever. It's so easy to get there.
Right.
And I think what you say about the brain and storytelling is important, because I know part of your approach in working with people that are addicted is to get them to tell their story in a way, like to be honest about not just that they're using whatever they're using, but to what extent, what specifically are you doing, and how much of it, and how often, and how recently, and all those kinds of questions. Coaching people to tell their stories of using whatever substance they're using. I have found that to be very healing and cathartic and liberating. It's painful because telling your story is, in a sense, outing yourself.
Right.
Right. And you have to deal with the fact that you're not as okay as you might have fooled yourself into thinking you were. And I appreciated in your book, your willingness to open up about little addictive types of things you've gotten wrapped up in, romance novels or whatever. I found that so refreshing because you got out of your sort of clinical place as an expert and you met your readers on a human level. And I, as a pastor, as a podcaster, whatever, I've found that to be extremely useful for people I'm trying to help, but also for myself. The more I talk about my past with, I had a real problem with pornography, and I think not talking when you're a pastor, you may not know what it's like to be a pastor. You're not supposed to talk about this stuff. You're not supposed to talk about how you actually had a problem. While you were in seminary or whatever. It's like nobody wants to think about their pastor struggling in that way. But when I started talking about it, and I would get really real with men's groups especially, I found it made it easier for men to tell their stories with pornography or sex addiction in various forms. Just yesterday morning, I was talking to a guy and he just felt super comfortable telling me all about his unhealthy attachment to massage parlors in the past and things like that. And I just think being honest and telling our story is really important. What is that? What are you listening for when you finally get someone to open up about how they're using and what they're using and how much and everything? What are you listening for that clues you in on what they're really up against?
Well, it's an interesting job being a psychiatrist. You listen to lots of stories over many years. I'm sure as a pastor, it's similar. And after a while, you develop kind of a sense of what healing stories sound like and what sort of not healing stories sound like. And one of the recurring themes that I became aware of over time was that healing stories are stories that in which people are able to talk about their character defects and what they contributed to a problem. So there are stories that acknowledge, the ways in which they've been victimized or traumatized, but then are able to also say, but here's what I've done that has perpetuated this problem or that's been maladaptive or hasn't worked for me. And one of the things that's so interesting to me as people go from being in their addiction to getting into recovery is how the story changes. And the story goes from being a story about how everybody else is at fault and I didn't do anything wrong, or this deep, kind of obsessional resentments toward others, whether it's a spouse or a boss or a parent or a child. And then it shifts in a really fascinating way toward, well, yes, this happened and it hurt me, but here are all the things that I do, that hurt other people or that have contributed to, like self-sabotaging types of things. And so what I really find fascinating about that is just it's like so universal in my clinical experience, that shift as people tell healing stories that are characterized by them being able to honestly identify their own contribution to the problem and not just blaming others.
Yeah.
And I see that as part of what I call radical honesty, which is another thing I've learned from people in recovery, which, people tell me like they just can't lie. If they lie, they're going to relapse. And that's interesting because it's not just not lying about their drug use, right?
Yeah.
It's like they can't lie about anything. Once they start down that road of like hedging the truth, especially around ways that they've been selfish or otherwise looking out for number one.
Manipulative.
Which we all do, by the way.
Sure.
I mean, the average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. And they're lies we don't even consciously notice. They're little things like, sorry, sorry I didn't get back to you on time. I was sick. Like, no, I wasn't. I just didn't do it. or another really fascinating area of lying is the way that, this is true for me, like feeling like the real numbers weren't adequate. And so like inflating numbers,
Ooh, yeah.
because it's sort of like somehow, what really happened just isn't exciting enough or doesn't justify my reaction enough. So instead I'm going to say, I waited for 6 hours. It was really like half an hour. Stuff like that. It's just, we were always doing that. But people in recovery from severe addictions, they realize I cannot be doing that. Once I'm doing that, I'm basically re-entering that double life where I've got my real experience, right? Both subjective and objective, what really happened inside and outside. And then the story that I'm telling about it, which is, if I'm not telling the truth, like can be very, very far from reality in a very short amount of time.
So is there fear that a little white lie, so to speak, would be a gateway to going back to using whatever they were using before? How does that work?
It's fun. I don't think anybody's ever really pieced it apart. It's for people in recovery. It's just sort of like it's a rule. It's a rule. You can't, and it's a big thing in AA too. It's like you got to be honest. If you're not honest, forget it. Nothing else will follow. But what I speculate on in my book is like, well, how is that operating? At what level is that operating? And certainly there's this element of like, it's once I start in the little lies, I'm more likely, to then justify bigger lies.
Right.
But I actually think it's functioning at a neurological level. I really do. So the prefrontal cortex is that gray matter area right behind our foreheads, which I told you is part of that reward circuit, where dopamine releasing neurons communicate directly with that prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the future planning part of the brain, the delayed gratification part of the brain, and the storytelling part of the brain. So our ability to delay gratification, right, wait for our rewards and not instantly gratify them and release dopamine, is intimately connected to the stories that we tell about our lives. And so I think and the prefrontal cortex essentially works like the brakes on an automobile. It puts the brakes on desire, right? And what's driving desire are the gremlins and the balance in that lizard brain, which is like the accelerator. So one of the ways to make sure that your brakes are working properly, which is your prefrontal cortex, is to make sure that you have good, truthful, healthy narratives, right, that stimulate and keep that part of the brain awake, and that you don't sort of let that part shut down and sleep, which is essentially what we do when we're leading the double life of addiction. We're kind of in a waking dream, right? It's this kind of not just lying to others, but lying to ourselves. We know that that's not the truth, and yet we're half asleep. We're sort of operating in this kind of a waking dream where it happened, but it didn't really happen.
Wow. Yeah, and I was thinking back to my own struggles and how I had a therapist afterward try to actually succeed in convincing me that my attachment to pornographic material was not, by definition, an addiction. I guess his definition of addiction is different from yours and I guess from the mainstream, because he wanted to suggest that it needed to be an addiction, it needs to involve a particular substance, and your own dopamine doesn't count. So it was more of a bad habit and should be treated as such. And what he would have said, or what he did say to me then, was that you can just replace a bad habit with a good habit and recover that way. So I remember very distinctly, he would say, when you have that impulse to use pornography, play basketball instead, or play video games instead, or do anything else but that. And it seems to fly in the face of what your research is leading you to preach, which is we need to learn how to do nothing or even feel bad and just sit there in it. Is that what you're trying to tell people?
Yeah, I think for minor bad habits, this age-old idea that you just need to replace the bad habit with a different type of reward that's not as bad. And that idea has been around for a long time. I think that can work for some people for minor bad habits. But once we get to the place where we're compulsively over-consuming and we've lost some agency,
Yeah.
and we're kind of deeper into that dopamine deficit state, we run into the problem where a minor alternative pleasure isn't going to work because it's not going to release enough dopamine to get us out of that dopamine deficit state. And if we do find something that's an adequate alternative and that works, then we're going to get addicted to that thing, right? And cross addiction is real. We know that from animal studies. We know that from human behavior. So instead, what we really need to do, and this is the news that nobody wants to hear, we need to actually tolerate the distress of abstinence long enough for the brain to reset itself. And then we even need to do things that are painful and hard, because when we intentionally invite pain into our lives, it actually works through the science of hormesis, which is Greek for to set in motion, where by doing things that are more painful than the pain of withdrawal, what we do is we signal to our bodies to start to upregulate feel-good hormones like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin. So, for example, exercise. Everybody knows about the runner's high. You pay for your dopamine up front. Not only does dopamine slowly increase in the latter half of exercise, but it remains elevated for hours afterward before coming back down to baseline dopamine levels. You do not go into that dopamine deficit state. So you paid for your dopamine up front, much, much better. And exercise has been shown to help people withdraw from other drugs. It's been shown to prevent the development of addiction. It's been shown to prevent relapse in people who are in recovery. And so, it's a great way to kind of set that hedonic set point to the side of pleasure without using an intoxicant. But it's effortful. You have to pay for the dopamine up front. And that's the hard part. So in your case, I can imagine that playing basketball, which is physical and effortful, might have been a good alternative to pornography, but not something like, what else did you say?
Video games and things like that.
Yeah, not video games.
Yeah.
Not video games. Yeah,
Actually,
that's not gonna work.
neither worked, but you're right. Basketball helped
there you
more.
go.
And it just helped me stay away from, porn and stuff, because I was probably too tired to try after playing basketball. But, video games never did that, had the same effect. Now, what would, Dr. Lembke, what would you say is wrong with us? Like, this problem still doesn't make sense to me, that addiction is so rapidly on the rise in our culture when we are more fortunate than anyone has ever been. And it would seem like we would get our act together more, but we're more of a mess in this way. To what extent does the American ideal or Western civilization's ideal of happiness play into, like, are we all chasing after a holy grail that doesn't exist?
Well, before I answer that specific question, because I know what you're getting at, I really want to emphasize that I really don't see this problem as something wrong with us. I see it as a mismatch between how our brains have evolved and the world we live in now. Because I think there's some danger in locating the problem, in our brains as if we have, something defective with the brain.
Sure.
The brain is actually working just the way it was meant to. We are instinctively and deeply wired to approach pleasure and avoid pain. And we do that iteratively through every second of our day, which again works great if you are living in a subsistence environment where just to survive, you better be relentlessly thinking about where you're going to get your next bite to eat. But is a complete and colossal disaster in a world where we have everything. We have everything. And where even food has become drugified, salt, fat, sugar, infinite quantity. So if we're then thinking more to your question on the meta level, well then what happened? How did we get here? I mean, this is really the dark side of capitalism, right? Capitalism is a wonderful system to incentivize, the maximizing of human potential and human consumption and human initiative. But we have reached now this tipping point where we're essentially titillating ourselves to death, right? Where we don't we're consumption machines. We don't really know how to live unless we are consuming, and consumption is everywhere. So the question then really becomes, how do we, what is a flourishing life? How do we live in this world given this mismatch? And I personally think that it's going to require a new kind of asceticism, which is this kind of minimalization of consumption and welcoming pain, including physical pain to a degree, into our lives. And then I also believe that, we're in a spiritually impoverished world, and people are desperate for some kind of spiritual or transcendent communion, meaning and purpose. And not just meaning and purpose that they find within themselves, but actually meaning and purpose in the universe. And so I think we're very much at like a crisis point too, where it's clear that science has done a marvelous job, answering a lot of questions, but doesn't adequately answer, those fundamental existential questions, doesn't even pretend to try to, around why are we here? What is the good life? What is my purpose? Why do I matter? How should I live? And so those are, I think we have to answer those questions, answer them in a way that resonates for our secular age.
Yes, I agree. And as a pastor, so much of what you've said has raised so many questions, and for me in my field, because Christianity, by and large, is in agreement with what you're proposing for us individually and as a society. I'm not saying we need to go out and, make the whole country Christian or whatever. I'm just saying there is a lot of overlap when we talk about ideals like self-denial, self-control being, a fruit of the Holy Spirit in us. Like, I don't know how familiar you are with all this, but these are things that are fundamentals to the Christian ethic. We don't talk about them enough, but Jesus said, to be my disciple, pick up a cross, deny yourself, and follow. What does self-denial look like in today's world where we're so impulse-driven? And the assumption is that, of course, you respond to an impulse because, you owe it to yourself. You hear that all the time. And again, it's hard to argue with that on the merits of it, because we're all stressed out and worried and anxious. And if looking at your phone 50 times a day gets you through the day, sweetie, you do you. But I mean, I totally agree with you, and I resonate with that. And what I'm trying to communicate to people, so my contribution, I hope, is that, you can look at all these messages through a moral lens. And you can also look at these messages through a neuroscience lens. Right. Because it turns out that physiology alone will argue for decreased consumption, restraint, abstinence, suffering, self-binding. So, you don't have to look at it through a moral or religious lens if that doesn't resonate for you, because the neuroscience is telling basically the same story. Yeah. You said earlier something, I'm going to try to remember the quote. You said, we have to learn how to endure abstinence, endure the distress of abstinence long enough for your brain to reset. Right. Which is just beautiful. But how long does that take for a reset? In my experience, and this is, people don't like to hear this, but I usually ask my patients for 30 days. 30 days of abstinence from their drug of choice, whether it's pornography and compulsive masturbation, so no orgasms with self or others, whether it's cannabis, whether it's alcohol, social media, video games. And I warn them that they're going to feel worse before they feel better. And this is a really important piece of it, because people will think, oh my gosh, I feel horrible. And now all my options are either keep using my drug or just be in abject misery. And what I emphasize is you will be in abject misery initially because you'll be in withdrawal. And people say, well, can you really be in withdrawal from pornography and compulsive masturbation? Absolutely. And it can be intensely physically painful as well as being psychologically painful. But tincture of time alone, just waiting
and not using that drug will allow the brain to recalibrate for dopamine firing to upregulate again. And then all of a sudden our lens will widen. We'll begin to, enjoy more modest rewards that we forgot about, right? That we used to enjoy and then lost the capacity to enjoy. We'll begin to see true cause and effect. We won't constantly be experiencing the intrusive craving to use, which is part of, this dopamine deficit state, part of the addiction. It's like we can't think about anything else. But then all of a sudden, you redirect blood flow to other neural circuits and you're not continually, looping around that same thought.
Yeah. So let's talk about the man that we're featuring in this podcast episode for the Maybe God podcast. His name is Russell Dixon. Grew up a preacher's kid, stayed completely sober until college. Like a typical preacher's kid, just Bible belt through and through. Played ball in college, was really an excellent baseball player, recruited by the major league team here in Houston, the Astros, during his junior year of college. Really doesn't last long as an adult in the real world before he lets go and realizes that in his mid-20s, his major league dream wasn't working out for him. And at that point, he really gave in to an Adderall addiction, to alcohol addiction. At one point, took over 75 pills in a 48-hour time frame, hit rock bottom. Is this a typical story? Is the athlete typical patient that you see chasing the high, chasing success, chasing the championship or whatever, but through all means necessary, and then falling short and falling into an addictive habit?
Such a classic pattern because, I hate to say it, but even sports has become drugified, not just for the athletes, but for spectators too, right? It's become distilled down to its most reinforcing components. There's enormous pressure and monetization of athletes such that whatever their original joy in the sport was, it often gets leached of that experience. And then it's all about their reputation and their social media profile and, how much money they're making and whether they got recruited for collegiate athletes. And then if there's some sort of wrench in the works, like, they don't make it to the pinnacle that they thought, or worse yet, they do, and they get that big trophy, and then they have to experience the kind of letdown of sort of, well, what now? Addiction, is looped into all of that, even before you add in, drugs, right?
Yeah.
Like that whole cycle and the way that people's whole definition of self and identity becomes part of that. And not just for themselves, I would say spectators too. Spectators so caught up in that, such a kind of a hypnotic for these masses of spectators, plus the gambling and the betting.
Right.
It's a quagmire. Not to say that it's bad. I love sports and I'm a competitive athlete.
Yeah.
And so are my kids. And, I'm a sports spectator, all of it, right? That's huge for me, but it is really remarkable to see how social media and quantification and leaderboards and rankings and stats have taken that thing that I think most of us could manage and moderate and turned it into something that can just completely overwhelm our lives.
And
then of course the injured athlete, the athlete on opioids,
right.
The athlete who gets traded or washed out or whatever. Very, very sad. Yeah, very typical story.
Yeah. And again, it's because of something fundamentally good in us or fundamentally hardwired into the human brain that has made our existence on this planet successful so far. That competitive drive.
One of the things I talk about in my book, because I just found it so fascinating, because I do, prescribe exercise as an antidote to intoxicants, as a better indirect way to get dopamine. But I also talk about the way that we can get addicted to exercise. And in animal studies, when sort of animals were sort of made to get addicted to certain substances by being put in a cage and learning that if they hit this lever, they could get a jolt of cocaine. Of course, those animals would hit that lever until they either became exhausted or died from a cocaine overdose. And then experimenters put a running wheel, a little metal, or plastic running wheel, and originally saw that as a kind of neutral way to measure the animal's activity, or even as a positive alternative activity.
Yeah.
That they noticed that if the animal ran on the running wheel, it tended to use less cocaine, which is all sounds good, and we can liken that to our own experience. But there also came to be reports of this realization that the running wheel wasn't actually a neutral stimulus, but that the running wheel itself could become addictive. And that there were some rodents who actually ran until they died, right? Or ran so much that their tail got curved up in the shape of the running wheel. That's how much time they spent on the running wheel. And then this absolutely fascinating experiment where they put a running wheel in nature just to see, like, here you are in the perfect natural environment. Will anybody get on? And all kinds of animals got in the running wheel: snails, slugs, rats, squirrels.
Wow.
So there was something, inherent in the technology of the running wheel that was appealing to, the animal's brain. And it probably has to do with like being lifted against gravity in a way that's stimulating and exciting and adrenalizing that's you can't normally experience in nature, because you're either falling down with gravity or you're climbing up, but you're not going whoop, whoop, whoop.
I get it. It sounds like fun. And I hate to run, but put me on a wheel, who knows? But I think there's a lot of people I could point to in my own life that, they would probably classify or qualify as addicts to fitness, to the gym.
Yeah.
And, it's given them curved tails too in different ways. The gym rats that just can't get enough yoga or whatever, and body shaping and bodybuilding, and their families often will say things like, yeah, we have to let him go to the gym, or we have to let her go to or they're not the same person. You get that a lot, and you laugh. Oh yeah, sure. But if it was, we have to let mom do cocaine and she's not the same person, like that would be a different reaction.
Now, to be fair, we were evolved for movement, right? We were evolved to walk tens to hundreds of kilometers a day. Our lives are incredibly sedentary. So in general, I consider it important and healthful to spend a part of every day moving our bodies as tolerated. But it's just a matter of degree. If you're then doing your sport despite injury and through, when injured and making the injury worse, or, to the exclusion of any other activity, and then we're in a different category.
Yeah. Well, Russell's parents, when he was hitting rock bottom, his parents talked about feeling this constant dread every time the phone rang. Is it the hospital? Is it the police? What's going on? And you probably are familiar with, the families and loved ones of people that suffer various kinds of addiction. What's your general word of advice or counsel to them when they love someone who's trying to get help?
Oh gosh, so hard, because there's this whole concept of enabling, right? The ways in which, with good intentions, and trying to support our loved one with addiction, we can actually make it worse by giving them money, for example, for food that they then use on drugs, et cetera, et cetera. The question of when to let them come home and live with us again versus when to turn them out on the street. These are really, I don't have, it's not a one size fits all. I don't have like, you should always do this, or you should never do that. A lot of times it's only in retrospect that people are able to see, well, this action was enabling, but this action actually saved my loved one's life.
Right.
So it's really tough. I think, getting support through organizations for family members or loved ones of people with addiction can be really helpful. Simply recognizing that addiction can be a family problem or a systems problem.
Yeah.
And that one person getting into recovery can destabilize the rest of the family. Like we want recovery for our loved one, but sometimes when the whole system has become sort of accustomed to a person's addiction, it can be scary to think that you'd have to come up with a new way of being. Or sometimes one person getting into recovery can unmask another person's addiction. So it's complicated. Yeah.
What are maybe some of the common mistakes you see people making when they are, trying to love someone through recovery or through their addiction toward recovery?
I think a common mistake is anger and rage and letting that spill over. First of all, let me say people are totally justified in feeling rage and anger, especially at the betrayal piece, even more so than the drug or addiction piece. The lying is what really erodes trust in families.
Yeah.
So I think, clarifying that so that we can be clear is something that people can do, like communicate to a loved one. I just want you to tell me the truth. I'm more upset about the lies typically than I am about the using. So if we are going to have a relationship, let's have it founded on trust.
Right.
And then, managing the anger and betrayal and resentment that way, but also, compassion for ourselves and our loved ones. The fear that comes in that fuels the anger, but then just realizing that getting angry, at the person who's addicted is not really going to be very helpful.
Yeah.
So try to find a way to express the fear and the sadness and even the rage, but not in a way that's like
destructive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other big piece is to just really watch for enabling behaviors, especially around monetary support. And if with repeated efforts to help this person with food or a place to live, you find that they're not really taking advantage of that to get into recovery and make changes,
Yeah.
Think about pulling back on that kind of support.
Sure. Obviously, anytime I hear an expert like you in your field talking about something like prayer having value to everyday life, especially to someone who's really struggling in this way, I perk up. You've talked about prayer being something that people should or can cultivate if it's something that they're inclined to do, something they believe in. Where does prayer fit into recovery from addiction in your mind?
I think prayer is so important because it acknowledges that there is a power outside of ourselves, greater than ourselves, that our will alone most often can't solve the problem of addiction and in fact gets in the way of solving that problem. And so acknowledging our own transcendence and recognizing the limits of our own will are just really fundamental to getting into recovery and to asking for help, to receiving help, humbling ourselves enough to receive that help.
If I could ask a personal question, do you find it important to pray?
I do. Yeah. I'm always asking for help, multiple times through the day. It waxes and wanes. I find interesting this waxing and waning in terms of the experience of being close to God or being able to feel, the presence of God or a transcendent power. But in my darkest, lowest moments, those are things that have just giving it over. Surrender has been just fundamental to my own, recovery from difficult life experiences.
Sure. It's interesting because I could also think about this. I could also put some religious pursuits in the addiction category. The more I'm thinking about
it. For sure.
People that chase religious ecstasy and, drop something like prayer when they don't feel the high they once did.
Right.
That reeks of the same thing you're talking about with addiction.
Yeah. We're problem-solving machines and we're constantly experimenting and we're trying this and we're trying that. So I guess if somebody's engaging in prayer and has given it like a good college try and it's not working for them, I wouldn't then say, well, you should just keep doing that just because, I would want to explore with them, well, like what is that activity for you and what? So I guess I come to it more agnostically in that regard. For some people, there's such an aversion to the G word. It's so powerfully negative for them. And yet, if you start to talk about it in terms of like mindfulness meditation or, I don't know, just different types of
new
language.
age kind of softer terms.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, oh yeah, that I get, or that, it's like, okay, well, that's fine. Let's just recognize, the spiritual element or our fundamental need for transcendence, which is so profound.
Yeah.
And I also think I would say it's also atrophied. It's atrophied, among many people today because they don't have an outlet. And so that part of their brain just kind of like shrivels up, to the detriment of their well-being and mental health.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like trying to like reawaken those transcendent experiences and orientations that are outwardly focused. I really think that's important.
Right. Now, I would say as a pastor, if I'm talking to someone I know to be a Christian and they're telling me I don't feel it when I pray anymore, I understand what you're saying completely, that let's find something that does work for you. I would tend to say, well, when you pray and it doesn't feel like it once did, keep praying, pray anyway, maybe listen instead of speak or do something different. But because I think that is actually our way of saying, hey, you're not supposed to feel it every time. Like you're not supposed to reach the mountaintop every time you pray. Sometimes it sounds like nothing. Sometimes it hurts to pray. It's like,
right.
You're always.
That's very good. That's a very good message. And I agree with you 100%. Like it can't be like, like a gumball machine, I put in my quarter and I get my gumball every time. And if I stop getting my gumball, I'm not going to be putting my quarter.
Right.
I think the key there is that the gumball will come, but it may come months or years later, right? But if you don't do the practice, you're not even going to know that the gumball came down because you're not showing up anymore to the machine. So that's probably a bad analogy, but that's just
I think
what
it's a perfect
to me.
analogy. Oh, to make God into a gumball. I've talked about God making him into a genie or something else, but like you rub your lamp and God's supposed to perform on demand. But I like the gumball machine analogy. That's spot on. Thank you for that. You've also talked about, just one more God question. You've also talked about, it seems like humans have evolved with some kind of God spot on the brain. Can you talk a little bit more about that from your clinical professional perspective?
Yeah, well, there's some interesting neuroscience, of looking at people doing centering Christian prayer or mindfulness meditation practices, and showing that certain areas of the parietal cortex consistently light up. The parietal cortex is like very advanced gray matter, late evolutionary parts of the brain that are kind of like the great national highway convergence where a lot of different systems come together and are interpreted. So that's interesting that there might literally be parts of the brain that get consistently activated across these different practices. And then, I guess I just feel strongly that, and because I've seen it, in my patients, that activating that part of the brain, however you do that, is healthy and is good, and can really help the recovery process and also recovery just through getting through any kind of difficult time in life. We don't exactly know how it works, and it may work because indeed there is a personal God out there who's watching out for us. But even if that's not really what's happening, and it's just working like on a neurochemical level, well, then great. Like why would you want to pass up that opportunity?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it does seem as though, even from a skeptical or agnostic point of view, it seems as though that it's something worth exploring, especially when you say something like what you said earlier, which is everything we're searching for, every release we're looking for in using these drugs is something our body already makes. It's like it's already been provided to us in the amount we need, mostly. And sitting with that reality can be I think it can be an antidote to the toxic pursuit of more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a kind of a trust in the universe and in nature and in our bodies, and the ability to sit quietly and patiently and wait for joy. And to recognize that those profoundest moments of joy come not at the exercise of our will, but come spontaneously at moments that we can't predict or control. And that there's an amazing beauty to that, right? On any given day, we don't know what's going to happen. And that's, in a way, that's the vitality of the universe and life. We think we want to control everything, but in fact, if we did control everything, like life would completely be uninteresting and it wouldn't be life.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's part of scripture too, is from my perspective, is that constant mandate for believers to wait. Just wait,
Yeah.
sit
Yes,
and wait.
just wait for it. Yeah.
And even
Trust.
just trust, be
Yeah.
bored.
Yes,
The Bible never
right.
says be bored, but I think
Right.
that's part of it, is sitting in nothingness and knowing there's something. And
and suffer
yeah,
and sit there with your pain and know that you're not alone and
Right.
that there's not something wrong with you.
yeah,
That's the nature of being human, that we suffer deeply and that life is hard. And, if we're lucky, we have moments of respite, but for the most part, it's hard. And so you have to just have faith that there's a reason and a meaning and a purpose, even if we don't know what that is.
right. Yeah, I think that, I mean, and you talk a lot about the intersection of pleasure and pain, and we don't have time to get too deep into it, but I know we already have to some extent, but when we talk about what feels normal, or my life is going as it should when I feel pleasure, and when I
Right.
feel pain, something's wrong with my life,
Right.
which is how we're all wired to think.
Yeah.
It is destined to set us up for some bad decisions, I think.
Yes.
And that's back to Russell, who's sort of the feature of our episode on addiction. He managed to get sober, thank God, and has been sober now for 10 years. And Russell actually
That's
became
great.
and he after finding his way to sobriety, became a pastor a few years
Oh,
ago.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, do you see that a lot? People that get clean, helping in their next career path, helping others in some way?
What I see, is sort of whether the problem is addiction or some other problem, that it's that service to others, the dissolving of the ego, the giving back.
Yeah.
That's really where people find, meaning and purpose and joy.
Uh-huh.
And, as they say, the best things in life are free, but very hard to come by.
Yes.
And that's generally true.
Yeah. And, as you said, Russell, as an athlete, as a champion in his sport, probably fit the bill for what you might expect, the type of person to fall
Yeah.
into addiction.
Right. That drive, that
Sure.
tenacity, the exertion of the will to accomplish a goal.
Yeah.
I mean, those are all things that are very advantageous, in many domains of life, but can be disadvantageous in this particular
Yeah.
aspect of addiction. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, are there types of people or personality traits that bode well generally for someone to recover? Like something you see in people that are more prone to recover?
No. And I've given up trying to predict who will and will not get into recovery, because I find that I'm wrong most of the time, and that these amazing miracles happen. And I'm just sort of a witness to this person's journey. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Dr. Anna Lembke, I'm very, very grateful for your time. I know it's valuable. I know you've got I see you doing interviews all the time, and you are doing good work, Doctor.
Oh, thank you.
You
Well,
are-
this has been a really joyful conversation for me, very stimulating and interesting. So thank you so much.
Well, it's been extremely joyful and stimulating for me as well. And I just really want to emphasize you're helping more people than you know with
thank you.
your, I would call it ministry. You might not with your work. Let's say that with your vocation here. I think you're doing incredible things. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That makes me feel good.
Thank you for your time.